Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you, Neil Quilliam and Chatham House, for inviting me here. I am honored to be in this storied location and to spend some time with you. I arrived on the plane from Washington this morning, so in advance and for the record, if I slur my words, say something you object to, or fall off this stage, it's jet lag. We'll just get that out of the way right away. By way of quick background, I entered the energy industry more by drift than mastery. I had been a Peace Corps worker in Senegal, West Africa, before going to grad school. I got to grad school, I realized I did not get rich while in the Peace Corps, and I needed a job. But I wanted to be a military historian. I love history. They really weren't hiring those, and so the career office was sending people to an energy consulting firm. This was just during and after the first Gulf War. And as I was putting data into an Excel spreadsheet on gasoline and crude oil, sort of looking out the window, it occurred to me that oil is a fabulously historical and economic and political and regulatory commodity. I never thought of myself as ever being a commodity analyst. When I graduated, I checked the pay scales for military history teachers and oil analysts, and that began my career in energy. I decided to write this book because of the weird price behavior over the last 10 years. Now, if you talk to folks in the oil industry, they'll say, look, I've been through 6 or 7 ups or downs. Oil's a volatile commodity, people will tell you. And it's true. Very rarely do we have perfect stability in oil prices. But we have never seen anything like the last 10 years in modern times. You just don't see crude oil prices go from $30 a barrel to over $140 a barrel without a war in the Persian Gulf in modern times. That just doesn't happen. And you don't see oil prices fall 60% in 6 months because OPEC had a difficult meeting in November of 2014 without an asteroid hitting the Earth or a recession or something. That kind of stuff just doesn't happen. These big moves we've seen recently in oil prices require an explanation. And the explanation required a deep dive into history. So in the 25 minutes or so that I'm going to be speaking, we're going to go through some history. And I'm going to reserve the forward-looking work to a large extent to the Q&A and then drinks afterwards. And trust me, if you stay with me, we're going to build some charts, we're going to look at some history you've never seen before unless you've bought the book. We got new data. Operators are standing by. We're going to go through some history, and trust me, when we get through the history, I think it'll help us better understand where we've been in the last 10 years, and more importantly, where we're going for what, after all, is the lifeblood of modern civilization. 1/3 of total global primary energy supply, and the only thing transportation runs on, and likely to stay that way for the foreseeable future. So we're talking about a very important resource. Okay, let's go into some history here, and we put together some slides. I want to commend British Petroleum, just around the corner. British Petroleum issues a report every year in which they have given us, among other things, historical crude oil prices all the way back to the beginning of the modern oil market in 1859. Those are annual average crude oil prices. But for me, when I did this book, I needed to see more volatility and more granularity, so my intrepid research assistant, Fernando Ferreira, and I developed a monthly continuous crude oil price series back to 1859. This is available freely to the public on our website. In the same vein that BP has done that, so do we. This is U.S. oil prices, because in the United States, while, as we shall soon learn, the government has influenced the price of oil, the transactions, how crude was bought and sold, was always on an arm's length free market basis. Okay, not so internationally so much, but in the US it was. So if we go back and we have to patch together different data series, and afterwards or in the Q&A I'm happy to go through how we got that back that far, we can piece together a continuous crude oil price series for the United States. Now, people, when you say, well, we're going to talk about history, it's outstanding. We'll start with the Arab oil embargo of 1973 because everybody knows nothing interesting happened before the Arab oil embargo of 1973, but that would be wrong. In my view, in order to understand the last 10 years and the next 20 years, we have to look before 1973. So let's start before when OPEC and Saudi Arabia took over. And there's the inlaid prices there before 1973. And what it shows you, it's hard to see a little bit from the distance, and we'll have another volatility metric shortly, that the oil market or the oil price has gone through relatively long periods of relatively stable prices and wild boom-bust prices. And what determined whether we were in a boom-bust period, which you see here, the first few decades, Western Pennsylvania was the world oil market. Wells being thrown up, people flocking in, oil being poured into rivers, couldn't take it away fast enough. Price would go up with high demand and then collapse, wipe everybody out, and it would start all over again. Now, this volatility in oil prices abhorred the early industry and was always a problem for the industry. And so what we saw was Mr. John D. Rockefeller came along as the first great volatility vanquisher in oil. Rockefeller comes from Cleveland. He's a refiner, so he's using the crude oil coming out of the ground, turning it into products consumers will buy, which back then was kerosene for lighting. Rockefeller said, this is crazy. This boom-bust oil prices, we can't have a serious business. I see a replacement for whale oil here. I see 24/7 illumination, which we need for education and for industrialization, et cetera. I see this thing going global. But not when we have this chaos in the fields, where an individual driller can drill under his plot and one next to him and one next to him, and they suck up the well too fast. The prices collapse. Can't have that. So Rockefeller comes along, and he's the first of what we think of today as an OPEC, the first supply regulator, the first price stabilizer. He did it indirectly. He did not go in and try and buy out all the oil fields or control the drillers. He monopolized refining and then integrated with transportation, the pipelines and the railroads that were bringing the oil from the fields to the refineries, and thereby indirectly brought us stability for the latter part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. But then we get into the 1900s, it's the progressive era. We can't have evil, literally he's a monopoly man. If you buy the game Monopoly, that's him. And we hate monopoly men and trust busters, and so we had to bust this trust up, and so in 1911, we bust up Standard Oil. And there followed something that's very important. It was the last sustained period of boom-bust oil prices, and we hated it, mainly because we were now transitioning from illumination into transportation. We followed you, the British, in transferring our fleet, transitioning it from coal to oil. Oil won World War I, Clemenceau wrote. We were getting into cars now. The electricity was taking over the lighting market. Oil was going, now it was a strategic commodity. Governments cared very little about oil in the late 1800s. By the 1920s, they could care about little more, okay? But when we got rid of this sort of price stabilizing force, we saw these booms and busts in oil prices return. After World War I, pent-up demand, the autos were booming, oil prices soared. Our Navy wanted to nationalize the oil industry, was terrified that here we just switched all the ships from coal to oil, thinking we'd have stable oil prices and plenty of oil forever, and now the oil prices are soaring in 1917, 18, 19. California is having rationing. The Secretary of the Navy ordered troops to seize fuel oil at the price that they wanted if they couldn't get it peacefully. We had investigations about gouging and so forth. The U.S. Geological Survey said we're running out of oil. Peak oil in 20 years, we're done. The first peak oil scare was at this time. Terrified. Then what happened? The oil industry did what it does very well when the oil price goes up. It found more oil, especially in Oklahoma and Texas, so much so that by the late 1920s and early 1930s, we've got chaos, and we've got prices at cents on the barrel and devastation. And then came the most effective regulator we've ever seen, the model for OPEC. And I have to say, I'm going to switch to this. Okay, please ignore the shameless plug from my book, okay? And focus on the soldiers. That's what I want you to look at. Do not look at the book stuff. Look, I worked, as Nick said, I worked for President George W. Bush and Texans all through the White House. I'm personally from Connecticut, a New Englander. And I work for Texans, and a lot of my clients are Texans, oil industry. I think I know Texans pretty well. And in my view, the supreme being put Texans on Earth for at least two reasons. One is to limit the role of the government in the economy. The second is to sniff out, find, and produce oil and gas. There's college football and barbecue, a few other things too, but those are the two main reasons. And so imagine as a researcher, as I'm doing my research, wondering how did the United States respond to these booms and then busts in oil prices. Imagine how shocked I was to learn that it was Texas, actually Oklahoma first, that in response to these price busts, designed and implemented the most communistic, severe, heavy-handed government control of any activity I'm aware of in the planet in history. To stop these boom-bust oil prices, 3 gentlemen on the Texas Railroad Commission, a regulatory body, met in Austin, Texas, once a month for 40 years. And they set quotas on drillers well by well, field by field. We're going to see a little bit some of their work. Imagine that. When OPEC is getting along these days, they meet twice a year and set quotas only Saudi Arabia really respects. This is the Texas Railroad Commission implementing drastic, had Mao Zedong seen this, he would have said, please, you're embarrassing me. Leave a little room for the private sector. That's outrageous. All right. These are the troops, by the way. Before implementing what they called it prorationing, the governor of Texas sent armed troops into the field to literally prod the drillers away from their drill. So the point here is even the wild, wild west conservative Republican Americans who supposedly believe in the free market and limiting government, the most free market loving of us, designed and implemented the most communistic policy we've ever seen to keep oil prices stable. Please hold on to that thought as we get into the modern times. Okay, now bear with me. We're going to present a chart, we're going to build it slowly, that's going to bring together some of the oil price and this supply control feature that we talked about through quotas. So unlike Rockefeller, who monopolized refining and transportation, the officials went right to the fields, turn it off. Okay, so here's the price of oil going back to 1955. Okay, the red lines. The red line is something called spare production capacity. And it's expressed in the left vertical axis as a percent of total oil market production. Now, what is that? So when an official or a cartel decides to shut off oil production that it could otherwise produce, it's economic to produce, otherwise produce, that unused production capacity, which could come back very quickly, just go and turn the thing, it's back in a few weeks, is called spare production capacity. You hear that often when you're talking about OPEC and how much spare capacity they have. In 2011, when the Libyan disruption occurred, we were wondering how much does Saudi Arabia really have in spare. Think of it as a buffer, an extra amount. Okay. The solid red line is total world spare production capacity as a percent of total oil market production. The dotted red line under it is, and below, that's in the United States. So the way we ran the 30s to the 1970s is the Texas Railroad Commission controlled basically the price of oil around the world by adjusting supply, just as OPEC is supposed to do, to meet demand and keep inventories from building or drawing and keep prices stable. And to convince the oil industry that the oil price will always be stable into the future. Okay? But when there's a lot of excess supply, what does a supply regulator have to do? They have to cut production. And so I want to call your attention to this high point of the chart here. 35% of global oil production capacity was being held off the market by official order or by a cartel. So what happened was, up until the red line was Texas and Arizona and Oklahoma and other oil states. And then the Seven Sisters, the major international oil companies, the BPs, the Exxons, et cetera, who controlled then the Middle East concessions, they would sort of piggyback on what the Texans were doing, and they would also hold oil back to keep prices stable. Consider that in the mid-1950s, early 1950s, they were holding 1/3 of global oil production off the market. When do we hold 1/3 of production of anything, especially that important, off the market? That is discipline. That is supply control. They did that to keep oil prices stable, because if they didn't do that, they know prices would have collapsed. Why did they have to do that? The Middle East reserves, Saudi Arabia, Libya, Iraq were coming on very strongly in the 1950s, and we hadn't had the 1960s sort of demand take off. So we were caught unbalanced, and we just had a lot more supply than we had demand. And the reason oil prices were pretty boring and stable in the 1950s was because of that. Now, OPEC takes over from the Texas Railroad Commission. And you have to understand, this is a transfer of power and lineage. I mean, the founder of OPEC, Juan Perez Alfonso, is a Venezuelan who's in exile during the 1950s. And he's seeing this stuff. He's like, this is incredible what these Americans are doing. 3 guys in Austin get together, and they just tell the drillers how much they can drill once a month. And they keep the oil price stable. We have to do that. And so when Mr. Juan Perez Alfonso went back into government, he went over to Saudi Arabia and said, you have got to see this. Come with me. And he took the Saudi oil minister to Austin, Texas. They hired somebody from the Texas Railroad Commission staff to be a consultant. Show us what you're doing here. We like it. And, but during the first decade and a half, much to Juan Perez Alfonso's disappointment, OPEC really didn't do any supply control. They were more interested in, this gets into the nuances, just making sure that their tax take from the international oil companies was as high as possible, and they were fractious and so forth. Only in the early 1980s do we see OPEC or Saudi Arabia play that swing producer role like the Texas Railroad Commission did in the 1950s. And you see that with the red line going up to about 20% of production. Okay? That is when we had a recession. This is after the Iran-Iraq War. We had high prices. We had a recession. The North Sea fields were coming on, North Slope of Alaska, Mexico, Soviet Union. A lot of new supply. We were becoming efficient in the OECD of the rich world. We were swapping oil out of places we didn't need to use it, like electricity generation or space heating, replacing it with coal, nuclear, gas, and renewables. And so OPEC had a problem. They had too much oil supply. For the first time since they were formed, they had a real problem like we did here. And Saudi Arabia played that swing producer role. It unilaterally cut from 10 to 2 million barrels a day. And in 1986, it got sick and tired of that. Everybody else was cheating. They were realizing, we're just giving up our market share for everybody else. The heck with this. So in 1986, they increased production, flooded the market, bankrupted the Soviet Union, and Putin has neither forgiven nor forgotten that. Extended the economic recovery in that decade, and the rest is history. But the Saudis said, we'll never go back and do that again. We're never going to be that swing producer, cutting year after year after year after year to surrender market share to keep the price stable for others. Hold that idea until we get to 2014. I'm going to stop back for a second now and talk about why are oil prices prone to wild volatility. It's probably a good time to do this. And we can go into more detail in the Q&A or afterwards. This is very quick. On the supply and demand side, oil is not very responsive to price. Demand for oil, supply of oil doesn't change much when a price changes for oil. Let's consider why. On the demand side, oil is a must-have commodity for which there are few scalable substitutes. If you are in the supermarket and you are hungry and chicken is very expensive, you can buy beef. If you have to get to work and you're tanking up and petrol is very expensive, you have no choice but to put that petrol in your tank. Your income goes down, but you have your demand, you're not going to go and ride a bike or buy a Leaf or quit your job just because oil prices have gone higher. So your demand is not going to respond quickly. Think of the other way. If the price of beer were to fall in half tomorrow, what would happen? I assume beer consumption would probably, I know I would drink more beer. I mean, everybody would drink more beer. But if the price of petrol were to fall in half tomorrow, what are we going to do? Go to a high school and drive around in the parking lot just for the thrill? No. So demand for oil doesn't change much in response to price. Economists call that inelastic. On the supply side, same thing. Takes a long time, years, we'll get to shale oil in a second, but years to find, develop, produce an oil field. And you have to use specialized equipment. A truck can carry coal, it can carry potatoes, it can carry diamonds. But to move oil, crude oil, which is a toxic, dangerous substance, you need specialized, dedicated equipment. And that means you have to invest a lot of money up front before you see 1 penny of revenue. Once you've invested all that money in that oil field, the cost of producing and flowing the oil is low. So if the oil price drops, are you going to shut off that capacity you spent billions of dollars, probably borrowed money, building? You will not. Your operating costs are pretty low. So you're not going to adjust your supply just because the price falls. So when supply and demand are unbalanced, because drillers found a lot of new wells real fast, their oil, and it comes on very sharply, or for whatever the reason is, when supply and demand are unbalanced, the price needs to move in a large way to induce relatively small changes to balance the market. Inventories can help moderate this shift over time. If you have inventories and you have too much, you can fill up inventories. But inventory capacity is neither infinite nor costless. And then you can only run inventories so low. So this is why, and this is true back in the 1800s and now, more or less true. And shale, we'll see, the bottom line really doesn't change that too much. I'm going to actually just stop here on this chart and make one quick point. These black bars are geopolitical disruptions also expressed as percent of total oil market production here on the left-hand vertical axis. So you see, I call your attention to this. This is the Suez Crisis, which you remember well. In oil market history, we don't remember it that well, even though it was the largest oil supply disruption in history, percentage-wise. Barrels were much fewer then, but percentage-wise, bigger than the Iran-Iraq War, bigger than anything else we see. You see in the black bars there other disruptions. Again, look what the price barely moved. Why? Well, when you have all that spare production capacity, you have a buffer you can use when there is a geopolitical disruption. So that's sort of a tool that can be used to protect the economy, to keep oil prices stable, even if you have a major disruption as we had then. So what I did here is I took my monthly crude oil price series, and I took for every year the percent change from the highest to the lowest in a year. I averaged those across the eras that my book delineates, okay? And this just gives you one estimate of volatility. People can do it different ways. This is how I do it. So the first boom-bust period, 53%. Mr. Rockefeller comes along, cuts that in half. We bust up Mr. Rockefeller back to boom-bust, did not enjoy it at all. In comes the Texas Railroad Commission, and we had extremely low volatility at a time, as I said, when there was big geopolitical disruptions and huge new imbalances in supply and demand. OPEC takes over, never did as good a job as the Texas Railroad Commission and Seven Sisters, about equal with Mr. Rockefeller. I contend that we are in history's third boom-bust price era, and that began roughly around 2008, 2009, as I'll explain in a second. Since we're talking about the price of oil, just a quick chart here. So this shows Brent and WTI. I assume most of you are familiar. There's hundreds of different kinds of oil in the world. There's no one single crude oil. It varies by weight. It varies by sulfur content. And what we found, especially the whole world basically went to market-based pricing in the mid-1980s. And so the way we do that is we have benchmark crude oils in different regions off which the industry will price their crudes, their specific blends, if you will, specific grades of crude, depending on the quality, the transportation, and so forth. So in the United States, we think of WTI as our benchmark crude oil here, and for most of the barrels that are sold in the Atlantic Basin, I should say, most of OPEC barrels is based on Brent. They more or less hang together. It got kind of interesting here in 2011-12. There was a difference where Brent was much higher than WTI. That's because we had found all the shale oil in the United States, but we hadn't built the pipelines to get it out. We were always thinking of taking oil off the water and getting it up into our refineries. We never thought we'd have a boom like we did. And plus, we had to change the law and make sure we were legally allowed to export the oil, which we are now, over 1 million barrels a day. So that explains the aberration there. But mostly our crude oil benchmarks are pretty much the same. Now, the common narrative, getting into the more of the common day, goes like this. Everything was fine until 2014, Thanksgiving holiday for you Americans, when OPEC had a very difficult meeting. And Saudi Arabia refused to cut production under shale, and they decided to embark on this new experiment of letting shale be the swing producer. Let's let the price fall. Let's let the market work. And we'll have shale. We actually want to really hurt shale and let them be the swing producer. And the price fell, but much more than they thought, to $26 a barrel last February. And they realized shale can't be killed that easily. And so at the end of last year, they got together with Russia, and they decided, wow, that was a scary thing. We better end that experiment. Let's get back to a managed market. And so now they're back and meeting, and they just May 25th. In my view, every element of that narrative is either completely wrong or overstated. We lost control, or OPEC lost control, not in 2014 with too much oil. They lost control here in 2007, 2008, when they ran out of spare capacity in peacetime. The United States Texas Railroad Commission lost control of the oil market. If you had to pin it on a date, it was March of 1972. The U.S. demand had been rising, rising, rising. Our supply had peaked. The Texas Railroad Commission was ordering all the barrels into the market. And on March of 1972, something very historic happened. The chairman of the TRC, Byron Tunnell, called it a damned historic occasion. He said damned historic because he knew this is America giving up control of the oil market. He ordered full production. And it was that moment that then preceded the Arab oil embargo. That's why the Arab oil embargo, which was actually a small amount of disruption, it was really OPEC just began imposing higher prices on us. We lost control in 72. In 1967, there was an Arab-Israeli war after the 56 crisis, a huge disruption. We don't talk about it, we don't remember it, because Texas had spare and increased 1 million barrels a day, a nothing burger. 1973, we all remember, because in 1972, we lost control. That's how we lost it, and that's how Saudi Arabia lost it here. Now, did Minister Naimi, God bless him, go to the microphones and say, well, another damn historic occasion. In July of 2008, we tried it, we gave it our all, but we threw everything we had. We just can't stop the price of oil from going to $143 a barrel. Sorry. Someone else will have to take over. No, he did not. But effectively, that's what's happened. And since then, in my view, Saudi Arabia has not been acting like a Texas Railroad Commission. Saudi Arabia has been acting like a country that is preparing to live with volatility, not manage it. It is investing in downstream, petrochemicals, and refining, securing outlets for its crude. It's not increasing its upstream production capacity, 12.5 million barrels a day, they say. No. They did that after 2004. They invested in Crisania. They brought up their spare capacity. You could argue that in 2004, 2005, they made their last gasp at playing the swing producer role, but not anymore. So in 2008, we learned that OPEC was unable to put a ceiling over prices, and that's importantly part of the job. The point of OPEC or the Texas Railroad Commission or a cartel is not to impose the highest price possible, a stable one. In 2014, we learned OPEC was unwilling to put a floor under prices. Those two things go together. Unable, unwilling, a boom and a bust. We got into this 10 years ago. Moving along now, I'm always interested in the idea of surprises, and I'm always trying to figure out what's the next big surprise. And it seems that, I think the last big surprise we're sort of absorbing in the oil markets is that Saudi Arabia won't be the swing producer. And believe me, that was a shock to folks. If you go back to consensus influential forecasts in the middle of 2014, they all assumed that OPEC was going to cut production to keep that oil price at $95 a barrel. That's why we were so shocked when Saudi Arabia decided not to do that. We almost can't comprehend what it is to have an oil market without a swing producer. It's like having a city without a fire department. I mean, it's unsafe. Now, one of the last big surprises and what caused the 2014 oversupply was shale oil boom. And this chart just shows you projections year on year, year after year, by the U.S. Department of Energy of U.S. crude oil production. That just shows you how, again, the oil market, one of the reasons it's wonderful discipline and wonderful to study is you never know what to expect. And things can utterly change in 5 years. This makes my point about everyone expecting in 2014 OPEC to cut. So these are forecasts of spare production capacity in 2014. You'll notice they are rising, okay? If you predict rising spare capacity, mathematically, only a couple things can be true. One, OPEC countries are going to invest more in production capacity but not produce from it. Or two, they're going to cut production from their existing production level. And when you say that OPEC is going to cut from 3 to 6 million barrels a day, that's the way you think, well, of course, because since 1932, there's been somebody whose job it is to prevent surpluses from developing. Because when a surplus develops, we get wild oil price instability, and governments and industry cannot take that. And so when Saudi Arabia said, no, we're not kidding, we're not going to do this, because in OPEC, Saudi Arabia is the only country that would do anything like this. And I said the last time they did it was in the early 1980s, and they vowed they'd never do it again. And Minister Khalid al-Fallah at the CIRA speech in February repeated it. I think you can take that to the bank. Then you say, well, wait a minute, Bob, I thought OPEC is doing these deals. They just met on May 25. There's a Vienna group, 1.8 million barrels a day off of October levels. Okay, let's talk about that for a second. Since the very beginning of the oil market history, there has been nothing like a price collapse to scare producers into temporary ad hoc cartels. The first one was called the Oil Creek Association of Western Pennsylvania. It formed in October of 1861 after the first oil price collapse. Oh, they got together and they drew up manifestos, all the drillers and the farmers, and they promised that as of now they were going to stop their production, and they all swore on their honor they'd do that. You can imagine. It lasted about 4 or 5 months. Vigilantism was resorted to. These things have popped up since. So remember, just February last year, oil was at $26 a barrel and falling like a rock. Banks in the United States were beginning to sway and teeter. People were getting concerned about financial contagion. This is how bad oil price instability can be. And in response to that horrific thing, just as we saw in Texas in the early 1930s, yes, producers will change their tune. And so, but I would argue the supply cuts we've seen since October last year, to make a long story short, and happy to go into it in the Q&A, do not amount to real supply control. I think they're talking a good game. They've been very successful at convincing speculators to buy crude, while actually not really removing much supply from the market, to make a long story short. So I don't think OPEC is playing its role here. And this kind of makes the point here. This just shows you changes in crude oil supply. The gray is the United States. That's what they're hoping to see, U.S. production go down. But you notice since January of last year, of 2015, they've actually increased their production. And there's a question now about how much they're really reducing their production now. And I can get into all the nuances if you like to in the Q&A. So I don't call what we've seen since then last year as a return of the Texas Railroad Commission or a return of a swing producer. So where are we now? We have the nightmare over the oil industry. And not just the oil industry, but the broader economy, broader financial markets, and geopolitical peace as well. Countries live at 70, some can't live or will die at 30. Can Venezuela avoid default at 30? I don't know. Can Putin win his election at $30 a barrel? I don't know. Is the Fed really right to make another rate hike this week if the price could collapse again? And all of that risk, and this is really of a price collapse, comes from these inventories. So this shows you the 5-year range of global oil inventories. And as a result of OPEC and shale and everybody else producing too much more oil, we filled inventories to very high levels. Now, what we don't see here are inventories in China and India, and we don't have good data for that. There's a lot of problems with data quality in the oil industry. It makes life interesting. But that is the problem we have, and that OPEC is terrified of. They want to get that green line back in the middle of the range. Now, as I said, since the oil price collapse in 2014, we've had 3 rebalancing rallies, 3 hopes that oil prices had found a bottom. Each of those reversed. The first was based on the idea that shale oil would be the new swing producer. That lasted about 3 or 4 months in 2015, and we collapsed again. And then they hoped OPEC would cut production in late 2015. And OPEC said no, and we collapsed down to 26. Now OPEC got scared, and they started talking about a freeze. And all last year we heard about a freeze, and they never froze production while they increased supply. If you look at the countries that were talking about a freeze last year, in the time they were talking about it, from January to November of last year, they increased supply by 1.4 million barrels a day. When they cut from October of 2016 from record high production levels. So the question now that I think that matters for the near term is, are we out of the woods? And I think you're seeing doubts now in the market about whether OPEC has cut enough and whether we are. I still think the risk is that we have to fall one more time in price to let you know my views. So that's where, this is the range of forecasts. The green shows you IEA's forecast, and that assumes OPEC countries agree to this deal and the other, Russia, agree to the restraint that they've put forward. And if that happens, we're going to be back in the normal range. Everything is going to be fine. You don't have to worry about geopolitical unrest. You don't have to worry about financial market instability. The oil industry is going to be fine. Equity is going to catch up. It's all good. The black line on top is the Department of Energy's forecast. Very different story. And by the way, OPEC's own barrel counters, their line looks a lot like EIA's. So there's a big difference among barrel counters. I would say few things matter more for financial market and economic stability in the next few years than who is right. And you know what? Reasonable people can differ. The data are terrible, and a lot of it is an argument about what happens to oil barrels that disappear in Asia that we just have no idea. So reasonable people can differ about this. Very important argument. Now, looking forward, I want to talk about the next big demand and then end here, I think, and then we'll move to the next part. As I said, I think every 5 years there's a big surprise. Shale oil, Saudi won't swing. The last few surprises have arguably been on the supply side of the market. In my humble opinion, the next one will be on demand. I question whether hopes and expectations of peak demand, whether it's peak gasoline demand in the United States, which is what the Department of Energy is forecasting imminently, is correct, or that we're going to see the efficiency gains, especially the policy-driven ones that we hope for. I don't get invited to parties much for saying this, but I doubt it. I think we're probably a little optimistic. And so if I'm right, in a few years we're going to have a problem that's going to create the next boom in oil prices. And this is, Statoil has an outstanding annual report, Energy Perspectives, and they gave me permission to put this chart from their most recent version, just came out this week. And it shows you sort of projections of demand growth there, with the circles sort of being the highest in their view. Others, there's a range. But look at the gray, that's supply. And so in a few years, we're going to have this problem. We're going to be looking ahead, and we're going to have to figure out how to replace all the oil that's declining from our currently producing fields while meeting demand growth. And this will have been after a few years of cutting investment in oil supply. And even my most enthusiastic shale oil clients don't think they can carry the whole world on their shoulders. So I think once we get beyond this question of these high inventories and who's right in the next 6 months, before long, we're going to have a problem, I think, with figuring out how we're going to meet demand growth for oil. And it's not just that maybe our policy drivers won't be as strong as we hope. Maybe the millennial generation, as they get in their 30s, will want bigger cars than we hope. But it's also the consumer response to low oil prices. And while, as I said, demand for oil does not respond quickly to price drops, give the people a few years of 50% off on gasoline and they will buy thirstier equipment, which is what we're seeing. And that they won't swap out easily, even if the price goes up. So again, I think more likely than not, we will go up. And this is finally, the International Energy Agency gives us a look at the supply side. And it makes this point here, this green dark area is the amount of oil from existing fields that are producing today going out to 2040. Notice how it falls off. The next layer is fields that have yet to be developed, meaning we pretty much know where the oil is, but we haven't spent any money yet to really develop them. We can do it, but we haven't spent the money. And then the light green is fields we haven't even found yet. We're pretty sure the oil's in the crust. We're going to get there. The red is light tight oil in the United States. And this is a scenario that assumes it doesn't go gangbusters around the world. And then NGLs and so forth. The point of this is we're going to have a problem. And it's a constrained supply side going forward. And if I'm right, thirstier demand than we'd like to believe. And if that's true, we're going to need more than ever something that we're lacking, which is a swing producer. Saudi Arabia is not investing in upstream capacity. Nobody is. They say they can produce 12.5, which means maybe we have 2.5 million barrels a day. I think there are questions about how quickly that can be brought on stream. I'll leave it at that. Large doubts in the market about whether they can produce and how quickly 12.5 million barrels a day. It's going to be razor thin. And if we get to a few years where we're tight without spare production capacity, and all we need is a little bit of a bip somewhere in geopolitics, and the price of oil is going to boom. So I end with 3 questions. Are we getting off of oil anytime soon? I didn't spend too much time on this, perhaps in the Q&A. I don't think so. I know of no serious forecaster who thinks in the nearest term, the next few years or even decades, you'll see a meaningful transition from oil and transportation. There just simply aren't scalable, affordable alternatives now. I hope we're wrong. I hope we all learn about something tomorrow. But until then, the answer is probably no. Do we have a swing producer? Absolutely not. This Vienna group is more like, to me, the Oil Creek Association. They'll be around for a while. Some of them last for a year and a half. They're all genuinely scared. They don't want to see $26 a barrel again. But as we get further from $26 a barrel, you get further from fear, closer to greed, cheating picks up. These ad hoc cartels always fail because of cheating within and supply growth outside. And I think we're starting to see history repeat itself. Do we need a swing producer? You bet. I don't have any answers for the problems I raised. I appreciate your attention very much. I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you very much.